Welcome to Beat Diabetes. I'm Dennis Pollock, and we're going to start today's program with a quote from Mr. Smith. You say, who in the world is Mr. Smith? Well, Mr. Smith, I don't suppose was ever too famous, but he was a significant figure in my life. He was my, I believe it was 8th grade science teacher. And he was a unique guy, had an interesting sense of humor, sharp guy. And somehow I remember him more than so many of my other teachers. And one thing he said I've never forgotten, he said, figures don't lie, but liars figure. And he kind of explained it that, some people, they're just liars and they're determined to use figures to kind of prove their point when they don't even really prove their point. Well, I'm going to paraphrase Mr. Smith a little bit. And I'm going to say, studies don't lie, but highly biased people do studies, read studies, and quote studies. And that really gets to the problem when you've just been diagnosed as diabetic and you're saying, which way do I turn? Some people, they get diagnosed and they're just lethargic. There's like, woe is me, I'm in trouble, I'm just not a lucky person, and they don't try to do anything. But many, the ones that usually watch this channel and the ones especially that I interview, they don't just say, woe is me and I'm in trouble and I'm not very lucky. They start researching. They start looking at the studies. Now, the problem with that is there are different studies that seem to prove different things. And if you listen to a vegan who's determined that everybody should be eating only plant foods, he'll quote studies. And if you listen to a carnivore diet person, they'll quote their own studies. And you start listening to this one and that one and watching this video and that video from people of different persuasions. And after a while, you throw up your hands and say, how in the world can I, little me, know what is right? They're saying opposite things. And, I've often made the statement, we're told to listen to the doctors or listen to our doctor. The problem with that is doctors don't agree with each other. And there are some doctors that have major, even hostile disagreements with one another. And they just absolutely despise what the other doctor is saying. So if you're watching YouTube videos, reading a few books, and they're saying different things, you're like, what in the world's going on? How can they both be right? So we're going to talk about that a little bit and talk about the problem with studies in general. One problem that is often an issue with studies is that people use the term, and it's a two-word quote that begins whatever they want to say, and the quote is this, studies show. And then they'll go on and talk about what they believe the studies show. They won't even quote the study. They're either too lazy or too scared, or they don't know, or they just heard it from somebody. So instead of saying, well, this study back in 1999, or this study in 2005, or whatever, they just use that easy cop-out, studies show. Anytime somebody says studies show and they don't bother, or they're too lazy, or they don't know enough to say what study, how many studies? Are there any contradictory studies to that? That just studies show, you know that probably you have a problem. Another issue with studies is sometimes you don't recognize just how small the issue can be. For example, if I say to you that eating meat doubles your chance of getting cancer, the average person is going to be like, whoa, I better stop eating meat. Now, I don't even know if that's true. There's some that have said that that's true, and there's others that don't believe it at all. I tend not to believe it, but let's just, for the sake of argument, make that statement. Studies show that if you eat meat, you've doubled your chance of getting cancer. But if we look into it a little deeper and parse it a little further, you realize that your chances of, in either case, of getting cancer from just eating meat are infinitely minuscule. For example, what if I found out that I will double my chances of being involved in a car crash if I wear a red shirt? Well, of course, that doesn't make much sense. But then I find out that if I drive in any other color of a shirt, I've got a 1 in a million chances of getting into a car wreck when I go to the neighborhood drugstore. But if I wear a red shirt, I've got a 2 in a million chance. Well, 1 in a million versus 2 in a million, you've just doubled your chances. But in both cases, the chance that that can have an effect on you having a car wreck is so tiny, it's not worth talking about. And sometimes the people who make these claims, you've just doubled your chances, they're talking about odds that are so tiny, so small, that they're meaningless, but they won't tell you that. They'll just say you've doubled your chances. There's another issue. Another issue with studies is confounding variables. For example, suppose I say, well, we've looked into the idea of hot dogs, and we find that if you eat 3 or more hot dogs per week, chances are you will lop off 10 years of your life, because people that eat 3 or more hot dogs per week tend to die 10 years earlier than those that don't eat any hot dogs. So the standard reply would be, well, if that's true, I'm giving up hot dogs, baby. No hot dogs for me. But there are confounding variables and factors involved in that, because you haven't done a double-blind study. You've simply done a correlational study. And the truth is this: hot dogs have such a bad reputation. I mean, almost everybody believes they're evil. I don't, but most people do. They've got a terrible reputation. So the people that are going to eat hot dogs 3 or more per week, chances are they're not very educated, and oftentimes they're pretty poor. Now, in my case, I am educated. I have a college degree, and I'm not that poor. But I eat hot dogs because I'm convinced they're not that harmful. But most people that eat 3 or more hot dogs per week are either not very educated or they're pretty poor. And chances are they've got some terrible habits. They may eat Twinkies 4 or 5 times a week as well. And they may be 50 pounds or 80 pounds overweight. Most poor people are overweight, or at least they're more likely to be overweight. So you got all these variables. Most poor people don't have good health care. There's another variable. So if you just look at people that eat 3 or more hot dogs per week, and you don't reckon on the fact that they've got all kinds of other things that are making them unhealthy, you could assume the problem is the hot dogs, when in truth it's not. They did a so-called China study. A guy wrote a book about it, but it's really not just about the China study. He made that one chapter in his book, and then he talked about all kinds of animal studies and all kinds of other things. But it's all correlational, meaning they went out into the rural China areas and they found people, Chinese people, and they checked out how long they lived. They found they lived longer than the city dwellers, and they lived longer than Americans, and they typically didn't eat meat. I'm not sure if that was because they were too poor or it was just their thing. But one way or the other, they assumed, okay, there's the deal. These Chinese people living in the rural areas don't eat meat, and they live a lot longer than ordinary people. Ergo, meat's the problem. Ben Bickman did a video about that, and he used an illustration I liked. I love illustrations anyway, but he talked about the ice cream / drowning that happens in the summer. And the point he was making is, in the summertime, people eat more ice cream than they do any other time of the year. It's hot, you eat ice cream. And then also, in the summertime, people drown more than any other time of the year. It doesn't mean every person that's alive is going to drown, obviously, but there's more drownings go on in the summertime, and there's more ice cream eating. Ergo, according to this logic, that ice cream is going to get you. It's going to make you drown. Well, no, that's ridiculous. You eat more ice cream in the summer because you're hotter, and it's a hotter time of the year, and you go swimming more often. How many people go swimming in December? So that's a correlational study, if you want to call it that basically means nothing at all. But these are just examples of studies, so-called studies you can make and conclusions you can draw that are 100% meaningless. And it's true with many of the studies that try to suggest that meat is not good for you. There are plenty of studies that show that meat is actually a health defender. But there are other studies, correlational, that would suggest it's not good for you. And so the thing of it is, if you are highly biased and you absolutely hate the idea of eating meat, maybe you think it's bad for the ecology of the planet, or maybe you think it's just a crime to kill poor defenseless cows and chickens and other animals and eat them. Or maybe it's just your religion, or for whatever reason, or maybe you're just a young person who thinks it's cool not to eat meat. But one way or the other, you don't like meat at all. So if you're going to do any research at all, you're going to lean to the studies that make meat look like the bad guy, and you're going to conveniently ignore the studies that show that meat is actually good for you. And so this whole issue of studies show, or this study shows that, and this study shows that, is very difficult to make a case for. You know, there would be one good way to do studies, but it would be immoral, and that is if you gave people something that was bad for them, that you knew was bad for them, and they knew it was bad for them, and you said, I want you to eat this for the next 10 years. Number one, nobody would hardly agree to it. But number two, it would just be wrong. You don't give people bad stuff, a bad diet that's going to lead to a bad end, and force them or encourage them to do that for 10 years, and then they die 10 years before their time. And you say, well, we proved our point. You can't do that. Now, you can do it with rats and mice, and some people do, but there's problems with that as well. They did a study where they basically forced rats to eat grilled meat, charcoal grilled meat, or some type of meat grilled over the fire, cut it into tiny little rat portions. And the rats didn't do very well, and they weren't very healthy after eating all that grilled meat. But the reality is, rats in nature never eat grilled meat, or almost never. They eat fresh meat if they can find it, or they eat seeds or whatever. They don't eat grilled meat. So you were forcing that poor little rat to eat something that was unnatural and that was totally against what all the years of rat existence had been the case. So, but speaking of studies, I do want to say, we're going to try to keep this short, but there is one study I think that is pretty legitimate, even though it is correlational also. But that's the study of America. Back in the 1950s, people were slim. If you ever see a picture of the 50s, 60s, even as late as the 70s, most people were slim. Most Americans were slim. And diabetes was rare. Child diabetes, youth diabetes was almost not to be seen. Fast forward to today. Americans are obese to a great extent. Things are terrible. America went on a gambit. America went on a gamble back in the 60s and 70s where we decided meat is bad for you and fat is bad for you, so we should eat mostly plants, very, very low fat. That was our gamble. That was our study. And look where we are today. Diabetes is off the charts. Heart attacks, strokes. Amazing. We've made so much progress since the 1960s. I know. I lived in the 60s. I grew up in the 60s. And things are so much better technologically. I couldn't be doing this kind of a YouTube channel, not that there was YouTube, but I couldn't do it. The cameras weren't available. I mean, there were cameras, but you'd spend thousands and thousands of dollars. The microphones, all the things that we use today, commonplace, weren't available. We've improved in so many ways, but in health, we're worse than we ever were, especially when it comes to chronic diseases and chronic afflictions, things like heart attacks, strokes, diabetes, and kidney failure. So, the best study you can do is a study they call an N1 study. What's an N1 study? It is a study based on one person. You know, a lot of studies, they say the bigger the better. So if you're going to do a study of 50, why not make it 100? If you're going to do 100, why not make it 1,000? But what about a study of one person? You say, what good could that prove? Well, it could prove a lot if that one person is you. Let's say you've just been diagnosed as diabetic. You have an A1C of 10, very high glucose, and your health is falling apart. You've got all kinds of diabetic complications. You're in the perfect place to do an N1 study, a study of one person. That's what I did. A study of one, Dennis. I didn't study John or Susan or Mary or Billy Bob. I studied Dennis. I would eat foods and eat meals, and I would test my blood sugar after the meal about an hour after I finished eating. And I would compare and note how that food affected me. And I saw all kinds of improvements in my symptoms, in my glucose levels, practically every way a person could improve in terms of health. I improved from my N1 study, a study of one person, Dennis Pollock. What I discovered was that when I cut my carbohydrates, let me say it again, when I cut my carbohydrates way down and quit eating sugar and bread and starches and breakfast cereals and began eating more high-fat dairy, fish, beef, low-carb vegetables, leafy green vegetables, using almond flour to create bread-like materials. When I started eating more naturally, more healthy and less carbs, my N1 study showed without a doubt that I had improved dramatically. And you know what? I'm convinced yours will as well. Start your N1 study today.
If you've recently been diagnosed with diabetes and you've just discovered this channel, let me recommend that you go to our Uploads page, which will give you access to every diabetic video we've posted since we began. As you work your way through all our videos, I believe you'll find the help you need. A link to our Uploads page is in the description.